I have three objectives in this brief talk. First, I'm going to offer some general remarks about normativity as it's understood in contemporary philosophical discussions. Second, I shall sketch and outline two philosophical approaches to understanding normativity, realism and constructivism, outlining some challenges for each. Third, I shall consider briefly the relation between normativity and social practices, viewing this question through the lens of the debate between realists and constructivists. First section, normativity and normative skepticism. Philosophers these days commonly understand normativity in terms of reasons. A typical view of this kind is that of Joseph Raz, who has written that, quote, "The normativity of all that is normative consists in the way it is or provides or is otherwise related to reasons." But what are reasons? Another common view, shared by Raz and many other contemporary thinkers, is that reasons are considerations that recommend or speak for and against prospective attitudes or responses on the part of a person or agent. Reasons for belief are considerations that speak in favor of affirming or revising one's judgments about what is the case, while reasons for action recommend the affirmation or revision of one's intentions. Considerations of this kind have an important, indeed constitutive relation to deliberation about both belief and action. Deliberation may be understood as reflection that aims to resolve the question of what one should think or do. So understood, it's an activity that can be engaged in either individually or collectively. Thus, a group of people might engage in deliberation together with an eye to resolving the question of what they should undertake to do as a group. Reasons, then, are considerations that are constitutively suited to figure in deliberative reflection of this kind. Now, if normativity has to do with reasons in this way, then norms may be understood as principles that state, in substantive terms, what people have reason to think and to do. Epistemic norms will be principles that specify, for instance, what counts as evidence in favor of the truth of propositions of various kinds. Practical norms, on the other hand, will tell us in general terms what agents who are situated in various ways have reason to do. Such norms may be more or less concrete or detailed, reflecting the fact that reasons for action differ in the degree to which they depend substantively on particularities of our situation and circumstances. Both more and less situation-dependent reasons, however, should be capable of being expressed in universal principles, which have at least potential application to other cases. To deny this is to deny that reasons are considerations that admit of discursive expression. Now, there are a number of questions that can be asked about both epistemic and practical norms of this kind. As believers and agents, we're eager to know which candidate norms for thought and action are correct, since that will tell us what we should believe and do. Answering this question in detail, however, is ultimately a task not for philosophy, but for deliberation. What philosophers can offer are not concrete answers to the question of what particular agents have reason to think and do, but more abstract reflections on the nature and status of norms for both belief and action. Such reflection is not, to be sure, irrelevant to questions about the content of epistemic and practical norms. On the contrary, in practical philosophy, reflection about normativity has been driven in considerable measure by an interest in a set of questions that lie at the center of philosophical ethics, concerning the normative status of morality. Are moral principles considerations that all agents have reason to care about and to comply with? What is the source of our reasons for acting in accordance with moral requirements? And can these reasons stand up in competition with important reasons of other kinds? I shall not venture into these questions in my remarks today, except to comment that discussion about them has generated some of the most penetrating contemporary contributions to the general theory of normativity. An important aspiration for much work on normativity has been to place this phenomenon in relation to the world of natural interactions and processes. Consider in this connection norms of instrumental rationality. These norms instruct agents to take the means that are necessary in relation to their given ends. In the modern era, instrumental rationality has widely been viewed as the single unproblematic requirement of practical reason. The instrumental principle makes no assumptions about the prospects for rational scrutiny of people's ends. Rational criticism of this kind apparently presupposes that there are objective reasons and values, providing standards for assessment of ends that are independent from psychological facts about what people happen to be motivated to pursue. But concerns of a naturalistic character have led many to doubt whether such independent standards can be reconciled with the metaphysical commitments of contemporary scientific practice. A world that's shorn of objective values or norms leaves no room for rational criticism of people's ends, but only for Weberian Zweckrationalität, the rational determination of means to the realization of ends that are taken to be given as a matter of human psychological fact. Those attracted to this line of thought should bear in mind, however, that instrumental rationality is itself the expression of an objective normative commitment. The instrumental principle says that we have reason to take the means that are necessary to achieve our ends, or at least that we stand under a rational requirement to act in these ways. And there's an interesting debate, which I won't go into, about the difference between reasons and rational requirements. If the principle represents a binding norm of practical reason, then we're open to rational criticism to the extent we fail to exhibit this kind of instrumental consistency, regardless of whether we want to comply with the principle or not. If naturalism really entails that there can be no objective norms or values, it may be wondered how an exception can possibly be made for the instrumental requirement. A more consistently naturalistic position would be to reject even Zweckrationalität in favor of a skeptical attitude towards practical reason in all its forms. Complete normative skepticism is, however, a radical philosophical position. Taken literally, it holds that there are no correct norms of practical reason, and correspondingly no facts about what we as thinkers and agents have reason to believe and to do. Deliberation, on this view, is an intellectual activity without a subject matter, an attempt to get clear about questions that have no real answers. In practice, however, we have no genuine alternative to engaging in deliberation to deal with the pressing questions that life presents about what we should believe or do. The consistent normative skeptic holds that this way of coping with practical exigencies for thought and action is ultimately a kind of illusion. Contemporary naturalists have attempted to avoid this extreme conclusion by developing deflationist accounts of the activity of deliberation. The aim of these accounts is to reconstruct the main features of deliberative thought, showing how such thought can be a sensible or advantageous activity to engage in, and one that has roughly the features that we observe deliberative thought to possess, even if it isn't ultimately answerable to facts or truths about the normative domain. The basic idea in these expressivist approaches, as they're frequently referred to, is to explain deliberative thought as the activity of mobilizing and imposing discipline on a set of distinctively practical attitudes and commitments. Much ingenuity has been expended in the elaboration of the expressivist approach, but it takes as a starting point the denial of the naive understanding of the deliberative point of view as a standpoint for thinking systematically and rigorously about a genuine subject matter, figuring out in this way the right answer to the question of what we should think or do. And this brings me to my second section, normative realism. I now want to turn to two philosophical approaches to normativity that, unlike skepticism and expressivism, do not deny the naive assumption that there are facts or truths of the matter about what we have reason to think and to do. I shall focus on the practical case concerning reasons for action, which has attracted the most attention from philosophers. The two approaches I'm going to discuss are normative realism and constructivism, and my aim will not be to adjudicate between them so much as to lay out some of their main features and to identify some of the challenges that they each face. It sometimes seems as if there are as many versions of realism as there are realists. But one thing that most realist positions have in common is the following. They can be understood as attempts to give expression to the idea that discourse in a certain domain is answerable to a reality that is in some sense prior to and independent of us. The difficulty is that talk about the concept or agent independence of entities or facts is rather dark and admits of a variety of incompatible interpretations. One way to make out the independence and priority of moral reality or normative reality would be to adopt an objectual paradigm of the real, assuming that discourse is realistic if it makes reference to objects or events that are both independent of us and capable of standing in causal relations to us. To be a normative realist on this conception of realism would be to hold that the furniture of the world includes, in addition to the ordinary physical objects with which our senses put us in contact, an array of concrete normative entities or values, conceived perhaps as particulars of some kind or other. Actually, I believe that the objectual conception of realism underlying this position is more often adopted by opponents than by proponents of normative or moral realism. It's kind of a straw man position. Nevertheless, we may agree that if a defender of normative realism wished to adopt this objectual interpretation of reality, the resulting position would not be very plausible. Normative discourse on this objectual construal of it would be conceived basically as a way of characterizing a peculiar set of normative entities whose independence from us is modeled on the independence of ordinary physical objects. And questions would then naturally arise about what the sense modalities are by virtue of which we have access to this peculiar domain of objects. There is, however, a more interesting and plausible way of understanding the idea that normative discourse is answerable to a reality that's prior to and independent of it. According to what we might call a factive conception of objectivity, the reality to which deliberation is answerable is not a realm of concrete particular entities or objects, but a set of distinctive facts about what is the case. The independence of normative reality on this conception of it finds expression in the idea that normative facts obtain in a way that's prior to and independent of our judging that they obtain. This way of thinking about normativity accords with the naive conception of it that I mentioned above. The realist approach holds that when we project ourselves into the practical point of view and set our minds to the question of what we ought to do, our deliberation is an attempt to get clear about an objective and suitably independent fact of the matter, namely what an agent in our deliberative situation has most reason to do. Nor is the postulation of such normative facts or truths obviously offensive to the modern naturalistic temperament. Realism is problematic if it involves a commitment to objects or entities of the kind that do not figure in our best accounts of the natural world and that cannot be made sense of in terms of such natural objects or entities. But normative realism, on the factive interpretation of it, apparently does not involve any ontological commitments of this kind. Of course, normative truths, if there are such, are not the kind of conclusion that we would expect to be able to establish through scientific investigation. But it would be an extremely reductive conception of objectivity that held that claims of a certain class can be true or correct only if they can be established through methods of disciplined empirical inquiry. Normative facts, if there are such, provide answers to questions that are essentially deliberative and that we ascertain through forms of reflection that are suited by their nature to address questions of this distinctive kind. Insofar as empirical or scientific inquiry is not addressed in the first instance to deliberative questions, the fact that it fails to return an answer to them, one way or another, does nothing to call into question the objectivity of normative discourse. Having said this, I should also say that some philosophers remain stubbornly and reasonably suspicious of the idea that there might be normative facts or truths that deliberation is answerable to, and that are prior to and independent of our thought about them. Suspicions on this score need not rest on the simplistic assumption that facts or truths should be countenanced only if they are ascertainable through scientific methods of investigation, an assumption that's been referred to as scientism, or even Philistine scientism, if you like John McDowell's expression. An alternative basis for them might be doubt about the postulated independence of normative reality from normative reflection. Deliberation is a distinctively human activity conducted by agents who are situated concretely in historical and social space. And it strikes some as incredible that there's a prior and independent reality that such reflection should be answerable to. Indeed, in the context of the debate about how normativity is possible, the postulation of an independent body of normative truths threatens to multiply questions rather than to answer them. Normativity may start to look like an objective structure that's completely independent of the will and consequently presumptuous in its aspiration to prescribe to us how we are to behave. A qualified skepticism of this kind is one consideration that's led some philosophers to seek a different account of the domain of normative facts or truths, which I shall refer to as constructivism. A second consideration that's led some to favor the constructivist approach has to do with the explanation of normativity. Normative realism, as I presented it, postulates that there are facts about what people should think and do that are prior to and independent of their deliberation about such facts. But it does nothing to account philosophically for the normative facts or truths that it thus postulates. If we ask what makes it the case that, say, X is what a given agent has most reason to do, the realist has no general theory to offer. Of course, for any given normative conclusion of this kind, there will presumably be something that can be said about why it is the case that the agent should do X. For instance, it might be that X is what the agent has promised to do, or what would make his partner happy, or something that would advance one of his important personal projects. But these are deliberative answers to the question of why the agent should do X, not general philosophical accounts of what makes it the case that facts of this kind obtain when they do. There is in this way a kind of theoretical modesty to the realist approach, despite the apparent audacity of the claim it makes about the independence of normative reality from normative thought. I myself find this theoretical modesty appealing, but many philosophers have understandably hoped for more from a theoretical account of the normative domain, something in the way of a general account of what makes it the case that considerations of a given kind are normative for a given agent when they are. And that brings me to a section called Constructivism about Normativity. Constructivism can be understood as a general account of this kind, one that begins from a qualified skepticism about the idea of an independent domain of normative facts or truths. The idea that's central to constructivism is that we, as agents, construct or bring about a reality that's not prior to and independent of our volitional activity, but rather its product. Thus, whereas the normative realist holds that there are normative truths that are prior to and independent of the will, a constructivist position will say that such truths are distinctively the result of our volitional activity. The question is, can we really make sense of the idea that the realm of the normative is itself constructed through our deliberative activity as agents? Now, there's one class of positions in moral and political philosophy that offers a comparatively clear account of the idea of constructing a normative realm, namely contractualist positions. These accounts represent the basic normative principles of justice or morality as the result of the choices of hypothetical agents under carefully circumscribed conditions. Thus, John Rawls defines justice by reference to principles defining the basic structure of society that a self-interested chooser would select from behind a veil of ignorance. Similarly, Tim Scanlon takes morality to be specified by principles for the general regulation of conduct that could not reasonably be rejected by persons who are informed about their situation and motivated by the concern to arrive at a set of principles that no one could reasonably reject. And there are, of course, many, many other versions of contractualist positions. But it's striking that these theories attempt to construct only a part of the larger realm of normative concepts. In Rawls's case, the realm of justice, and in Scanlon's, the morality of right and wrong. The contractualist apparatus that gives a content to the metaphor of construction is in each case embedded within a larger context of normative concepts that are not themselves explicated in terms of a hypothetical choice situation, including reasons for action that are grounded in agents' projects, life plans, relationships, aspirations, conceptions of the good, and so on. Constructivism about normativity to core takes a considerably more ambitious line. It holds that all normative facts and principles are ultimately constructed through the volitional activity of the agents to whom they apply. To make good on this position, however, it seems that we'll need to unpack the metaphor of construction in terms that are different from the terms that contractualism offers. For I doubt that we can really make sense of the idea that all normative principles are the result of a hypothetical choice under specified conditions. To render this idea coherent, we'd need to imagine agents making choices under parameters that can be represented without recourse to any normative concepts whatsoever. And our ideas of agency and choice would arguably give way under these conditions. As Thomas Nagel has said, some unchosen normative constraints on choice would seem to be among the conditions of its possibility. If I understand the constructivist position, it would seem to move in a rather different direction from these familiar contractualist accounts. The generalized constructivist account of normativity rests ultimately on the idea that the normative principles that govern the will are the very same principles that are constitutive of the will in the first place. Thus, in a sympathetic discussion of Kant's views on freedom and morality, Christine Korsgaard writes that, quote, "The categorical imperative is a principle of the logic of practical deliberation, a principle that's constitutive of deliberation, not a theoretical premise applied in practical thought." The idea seems to be that the normativity of practical principles is to be accounted for by showing that we commit ourselves to complying with them when we undertake to act. Normative principles are universally binding on all agents in these terms, just in case a commitment to such principles is constitutive of willing anything at all. Candidates for such universal principles of willing in this sense include the instrumental principle discussed above, telling us to take the necessary means to our ends, and in Kantian variants such as Korsgaard's, the categorical imperative or the moral law. The element of construction in this approach is to be understood not in terms of the hypothetical choice of principles, as in contractualist theories. It refers more basically to the fundamental role of practical activity in grounding the principles that regulate that very activity. Principles of practical reason are not principles whose normative force is prior to and independent of the will. Rather, they're principles that are rendered normative for us by our act of willing itself, insofar as they describe constraints that we aspire to comply with in willing as we do. Constructivism in this form, appealing to principles that we commit ourselves to through our volitional activity as individual agents, might be contrasted with social or dialogical forms of constructivism. On individualist approaches, it's the activity of willing or intending by an agent that grounds the principles that are normative for that agent. Social or dialogical positions, by contrast, appeal to activities that are essentially social or interpersonal, such as reasoned discussion or debate in the theoretical domain, or in the domain of practice, attempts to deliberate collectively, or to justify one's behavior to other people. The activity through which normativity is constructed on these accounts is an activity with a plural rather than a singular subject, such as the activity engaged in by two or more individuals together of dialogue or discourse or joint deliberation. So there are individual and social variants of this constructivist idea. This, in outline, is the constructivist approach. Unlike normative realism, it at least attempts to develop a comprehensive philosophical account of the phenomenon of normativity, rather than simply taking that phenomenon for granted. Furthermore, the account it offers has some undoubted intuitive appeal. On the realist approach, deliberative activity is said to be answerable to principles that are prior to and independent of it. But it might reasonably be asked why we should care when we engage in deliberation about principles that are, by hypothesis, independent of the activities they are said to govern. Constructivism, at least on the surface, appears to provide an answer to the question as to why individual or collective deliberation is answerable to the normative principles that regulate it. If principles become normative for us through our volitional and deliberative activities, then in engaging in those activities, we have already committed ourselves to complying with the principles to which the activities are answerable. The constructivist's philosophical account of normativity thus promises to illuminate the fundamental idea that there are normative truths to which we are responsible when we deliberate about what to do. It does this by interpreting those truths as created by the very activities they are to govern. There are, however, important questions that can be raised about the constructivist program, understood along these lines. A fundamental question concerns the nature of the commitments that allegedly tie us to normative principles. The constructivist idea is that our activity as agents commits us to complying with the principles that define what we have reason to do. But what is it to be committed in this way to complying with a given principle for action? So there are a variety of ways this might be interpreted. I'm going to skip over some details here, but I think a starting idea might be that to be committed to complying with a principle is to have some kind of behavioral disposition expressed in a tendency to action or an intention to action to comply with the principle in question. But it seems to me that we can't understand the notion of commitment simply in terms of kind of behavioral motivation or tendency of that sort. The basic idea here is that the fact that you have a behavioral tendency to do something doesn't make it the case plausibly that you have reason to do it. So for this reason, among others, I don't believe that the notion of commitment as it figures in constructivism can be construed exclusively in behavioral terms. Something else must be involved in the stance of commitment to the principles that are binding on us. But what might this be? On the most plausible interpretation, I would suggest the additional element that's built into the stance of commitment beyond a motivational or behavioral tendency is an attitude of normative endorsement. To be committed to complying with a principle in the way that renders it normative is not merely to be disposed actively to such compliance, but also to regard the behavior as one to which one is thus disposed as justified, something one has reason to engage in. It is to have a kind of normative belief, endorsing the behavior to which one's disposed in light of considerations that one takes to count in favor of it. It remains a bit obscure, however, how this further dimension of volitional commitment helps to account for the normativity of the principles to which agents are committed. If the story I've been telling is on the right lines, then to be committed to a principle is, inter alia, to regard compliance with the principle as justified, something one has significant reason to go in for. In these terms, the instrumental principle, for instance, would be binding on us insofar as we're committed to regarding it as binding in willing something as an end. The problem, however, is that this does not appear to secure the objective normativity of the principles to which the agent is committed. From the mere fact that I regard a principle as normative, justifying the actions that comply with it, it doesn't appear to follow that the principle is normative in fact. There's a potential gap between the subjective attitude of normative endorsement and the objective normativity of the principle thus endorsed. Thinking something is the case, even when one cannot help thinking that it is the case, doesn't make it so. In response to this concern, constructivists might perhaps question the conception of objectivity that the concern seems to presuppose. The worry, in a nutshell, is that normative thought might ultimately fail to correspond to the reality it attempts to represent. As I noted above, however, constructivism seems to rest on a qualified skepticism about the very idea of an independent reality to which deliberative thought and activity are answerable. The skeptical idea is that it's not really plausible to suppose that an activity of this kind should be answerable to a realm of facts that's prior to and independent of it. If this supposition is suspect, however, then the gap that I just noted between an agent's normative attitudes and the objective facts about normativity that those attitudes attempt to represent cannot really open up, because there are no mind-independent facts of the relevant kind. Another way to put this point is to note that normativity, on the constructivist account of it, is an artifact of the deliberative point of view. Normative facts come into existence through our deliberative and volitional activity, and they can be grasped or made sense of only from the deliberative point of view. I think this is the internal point of view in a way that Klaus was referring to earlier on. When we step back from the normative commitments that are constitutive of that standpoint and ask whether those commitments do or do not correspond to putatively objective normative facts, then normativity seems to disappear from the scene. We're left with a conception of the world that includes attitudes of individual and collective agents, including attitudes with a normative content, and a world that's devoid of independent normative constraint. And this is one reason why constructivist positions are sometimes mistaken by interpreters, I think, as representing forms of skepticism or expressivism even. They have a similar, they appear similar when you step back from the deliberative point of view. It looks like the constructivist is redescribing our deliberative activity in terms of the attitudes of agents. But I think the difference between constructivists and expressivists is that constructivists would deny the fully skeptical conclusion. They're trying to maintain and account for normative facts. They merely insist that these facts are, as I put it, an artifact of the deliberative point of view and need to be understood in relation to that distinctive point of view. And that brings me to my final brief conclusion: reasons in social practice. So much for my brief sketch of the realist and constructivist approaches. I want now, in conclusion, to comment very briefly on the implications of these two approaches for the question of the relation between normativity and social practice. Constructivist approaches, as I've interpreted them, would seem to have a very straightforward account to offer of this relation. If normativity is constructed through the individual and collective activities of agents, then normative principles will be dependent on social and historical practice to just the extent that the activities through which they are constructed are so dependent. Whatever else we might want to say about individual and collective deliberation, however, it's clearly an activity that's engaged in by historically and socially situated agents who are operating against the background of contingent practices of various kinds. There's nothing philosophically mysterious about the formation of a given normative order, as we might call it, insofar as all normativity is formed as the result of the concrete activities of individuals and groups of individuals at particular places and times. The challenge for the constructivist in this area, it would seem, is not to explain the potential dependence of normativity on historical and social conditions, but to make sense of the possibility of historical and social error about the normative. Constructivism traces normative facts to the deliberative activities of agents, in particular to their normative beliefs and commitments. But it's a commonplace that beliefs and commitments of this kind can be mistaken. Not everything that a given individual or society might think about what there is good reason to do is correct. Each of us will have their own examples of this phenomenon, but to make the issue more concrete, consider individuals or societies that accept regimes of systematic discrimination and intolerance. How are we to think about the possibility of error in normative conviction if we follow the constructivist in grounding normative facts on such convictions? The most promising option for responding to this concern would probably be to exploit the idea of reflection. Constructivism understands normativity in terms of the normative commitments of actual historically situated individuals and groups. But not all actual commitments of this kind are actually acknowledged. I might be committed to the conclusion that there's good reason not to engage in discriminatory practices without yet seeing clearly that this is the case. Under these conditions, we could say that I have reason to avoid discrimination insofar as that normative conclusion is a commitment of my actual deliberative standpoint that I would acknowledge if I were to reflect more fully on the matter. Actual normative beliefs might be shown to be mistaken in these terms if they're beliefs that wouldn't survive further deliberative reflection, and unacknowledged normative conclusions might be true if one would come to acknowledge them through a reflection of the same kind. There are two things to note about this constructivist theory of error, however. First, it rests on fairly optimistic assumptions about the trajectory that deliberative reflection will take in any agent or group of agents who undertakes to deliberate thoughtfully and completely about what there is reason to do. Kantian constructivists, as I noted above, hold that there are normative commitments that are constitutive of the practical point of view, including commitments to the instrumental principle and the moral law, and that these commitments would be acknowledged by any individual or collective agent who takes reflection to its natural conclusion. It is, however, to put the point in the mildest possible terms, a matter of continuing philosophical controversy whether there are any constitutive principles of rational willing of this kind. If not, then constructivism will entail potentially a substantive relativism about the normative that leaves us without the resources to understand certain kinds of apparent normative error. In addition, there's something in the logic of the constructivist approach that pushes us in the direction of taking actual normative beliefs to establish normative facts, even if the beliefs in question are not ones that would survive further reflection by the agent who holds them. Thus, the basic inspiration of the constructivist view is the idea that we construct normative reality through our deliberative activity. Normativity becomes, on this way of seeing it, as I suggested earlier, an artifact of the deliberative point of view. If we take this idea seriously, however, then it seems we have to grant an agent's actual normative views a certain default authority in determining what that agent has reason to do, even if the views in question are ones that would be undermined or revised by further reflection. Some individual or society that believes they have reason to discriminate against the members of a religious or ethnic minority group may actually have reason to engage in the discriminatory behavior, at least until they come to revise their views in this matter. We could reject this conclusion only if we could reject the default authority of actual normative beliefs and commitments for the individual or group that holds them. But that in turn would threaten the basis of the appeal to reflection, which rests on the authority of our actual commitments to determine the trajectory that reflection can take for us. Normative thought thus threatens to become peculiarly self-validating. Thinking that you have reason to do X really does make it the case that you have reason to do X. The realist position, of course, has an easier time conceptualizing the possibility of normative error. Insofar as normative facts are taken to be prior to and independent of our thought about them, it's always possible that our beliefs about them might fail to track the truths to which they are answerable. We might, for instance, falsely take ourselves to have good reason to do something that we don't in fact have good reason to do, or we might fail to accept normative conclusions that are both objectively correct and directly relevant to our own practical situation. And there are some qualifications here, but I'll pass over them. If normative realism thus accommodates robust possibilities for deliberative error, however, it also threatens to downplay or marginalize the apparent dependence of normativity on social and historical practice. Normativity cannot, at any rate, be said to inherit the historical contingency of deliberative agency, as it automatically does on the constructivist approach. What can we say about the formation of normative orders, then, if we accept the realist's framework for thinking about normativity? This is a very large question which I can't hope to do justice to on this occasion. But I want to conclude my remarks by mentioning very briefly three ways, schematic ways, in which the contingency of normative orders might be accommodated within a broadly realist position. First, it's a familiar truth that voluntary undertakings of a wide variety of kinds can have normative significance, both for the agent who undertakes them and for those who interact with that agent. By making a promise or signing a contract, I can bring it about that I have reason to do something that I would otherwise not have had reason to do. By treating you with hostility or contempt or disregard, I can give you reason to avoid me or to adjust your behavior towards me in other ways. And by consenting to your treating me in a certain way, I can remove objections to such treatment that would otherwise be in place. Realism has no difficulty acknowledging reasons of this kind, and it can thereby acknowledge one important way in which normative facts can be shaped by human agency. The cases just mentioned, of course, are all examples of discrete undertakings that affect the normative situation of agents interacting with each other individually. But more complex social examples of the same general phenomenon are equally familiar. Thus, political agency involves exercises of collective authorization and consent that similarly give rise to important reasons that would not otherwise obtain. Once a law has been passed through mechanisms of legitimate political deliberation, all those subject to the relevant authority have reason to comply with it, a reason that they did not have prior to the laws taking effect. Legislation and other forms of collective decision-making can thus be understood as processes through which new normative orders are formed through the undertakings of individuals acting together. The second point is this. A different way in which realism can acknowledge the role of agency in the formation of normative regimes involves valuable social practices and conventions. Many of the activities and roles that most importantly constrain our reasons for action rest on contingent social and historical practices. Consider in this connection such activities as opera, philosophy, and football, as well as the institutions that sustain those valuable activities, universities, for example. These things are all clearly rest on practices and conventions, or to some extent are practices and conventions, that are historically contingent, having emerged at particular times and places as a result of social processes that are far from universal and that might well have turned out very differently. It seems equally clear, however, that the activities and institutions that have emerged in this way are valuable and that they are elaborate sources of normative aspiration and constraint once they come into existence. We have reason to participate in these valuable activities, to learn about them and try to understand them, and to support and nurture the institutions that keep them going. And these are reasons we wouldn't have had if the relevant social practices had not, in fact, evolved in the ways that they did. Normative orders can thus emerge through the historical and social processes that give rise to contingent but valuable practices and conventions. Finally, there's a different kind of role that can be played by contingent social practices and conventions. Consider in this connection the conventions of etiquette or politeness. It's a truism that there's a high degree of variation in the requirements of etiquette that are in place in different societies and at different historical epochs. Enthusiastic, raucous clapping and shouting used to be expected and encouraged at musical performances in Europe and America in earlier centuries, even between movements of longer pieces, whereas such behavior is now widely frowned upon, at least in venues of classical performance. Some cultures tolerate and even promote a high degree of informality and openness in interactions between strangers. That's common in California, for instance. While similar behavior would be met with disapproval in other social formations. Cultural conventions of this kind shape the expectations of the individuals who live under them, and this in turn functions to mediate the more abstract and universal moral values that govern their interactions with each other. We all stand under general requirements to respect other people and to show them consideration and regard, but what exactly we must do to live up to these abstract values will depend critically on the particular social conventions that are in place in the societies in which we live. Contingent social practices give rise to new normative orders by defining for the individual subject to them the forms of behavior that realize and respect more fundamental values and norms. So, thank you very much.